We're taking a break from the technical material for one class here to talk about ethics. Statistics is pretty big business. Many researchers, governments, pundits, pollers, advertisers, companies all need good statistical information and are willing to pay statisticians to produce that information. As a big business, its ethics are the subject of considerable deliberation and debate. To give some context, I'll start with some official sources. There is a Statistical Society of Canada that publishes a code of ethics for statistical practice. This is intended to be a guide for its members, who are for the most part professional statisticians. Determining ethics can never be done in a vacuum. Ethics needs to be motivated by some starting principles. This code starts with 4 principles. Statisticians have responsibility to society, to employers and clients, to other practitioners. And in addition to these specific responsibilities, they have a sense of professionalism that should motivate their ethics. Statistics Canada is the statistical branch of the government. They are responsible for many things, but perhaps most notably for the census and the many statistical analyses that can be derived from the census. They also start from some principles listed here. These are a bit more specific than the previous lists, and perhaps are motivated by its status as a government agency. The Tri-Council is Canada's natural research funding organization. It's also governmental, but operates somewhat independently. It likewise publishes ethical guidelines about how to use stats. These guidelines matter a great deal since anyone who accepts Tri-Council funding, including several King's professors, must abide by these rules. They also have starting principles listed here. These are again specific. They are about how to conduct research, hence the focus on things like consent of human research subjects, confidentiality of research information, and animal care of animal research subjects. Let's spring off from these Tri-Council guidelines into some specifics about ethical statistics. Tri-Council cared about confidentiality, consent, and animal care. That's all about gathering data. So what can we say in general about the ethical guidelines for data? Well, here are some questions. Was the data collected ethically? If human subjects were involved, were they informed and did they consent? If animals were involved, were they treated as well as reasonably can be treated? And if they suffered hardship, as is often the case in medical research, was there justification for that hardship in the value of the potential research outcomes? Was the data stored carefully and confidentially? Similarly, is there bias in the data? This gets back to the issue of experimental design that we talked about early in the course. Bias is an ethical issue in addition to producing questionable research. One of the most well-known and documented biases in research is the sex bias in historical medical research. For decades and decades, the male human was simply assumed to be the default subject, and males were used for most medical trials. But surprise, it turns out that there are biological differences between the sexes, and those differences present in a wide variety of ways, including different symptoms for common ailments, different reactions to medications, different physiological effects of lifestyle choices, etc., etc. Much of medical science has been correcting these biases for a long time now, but that work is still ongoing because of how entrenched those biases were. Other than bias, we've already talked about some other limitations of data. Observational data and data without a control group both present strong limitations to drawing statistical inference. All of this is about data before any statistical methods are actually used. You may have noticed in the Stats Canada slide, the guidelines were for the broader term data science, not just statistics. It all fits together. Not asking the necessary questions about your data and how it was produced is an ethical failing, even before any mathematics is done. Well, then we get into the mathematics itself. Mathematics unfortunately has the reputation of being a neutral thing, just a set of tools. Hopefully in this course you are realizing that judgment cannot be separated from the use of mathematical tools. Judgment is baked in. We've already seen many instances of judgment in the course. How do you decide which visualization to use? How do you determine a null hypothesis? What threshold of statistical significance do you use? What threshold of confidence do you use for a confidence interval? What level of correlation or R-squared value justifies a linear regression? Which variables do you assume to be explanatory? There is an even larger overarching judgment here. Stats has many tools. You've seen a few, but only just a few amongst a whole jungle of techniques. You can't use them all. You can't even use most of them. You don't have time and energy. So what do? How do you decide what kind of tests and visualizations to bring to some data? It's all judgment. And there is something, in fact, deeper going on here as well, which I feel the need to point out. I'm a mathematician, and sometimes I get into discussions about the ethics of mathematics. Very often, if someone is asked about the ethics of mathematics, the response is something like this. Well, mathematics is inert, just a set of tools. A tool doesn't have ethics, but the use of a tool has ethics. Mathematics in itself is ethically blank, but whether you use mathematics for good or ill ends determines its ethics. I want to argue here, in the context of stats, that this is a myth. There is no such thing as a neutral tool, whether that tool is a hammer or a hypothesis testing technique. I want to give you two reasons. First, when you have a tool at your disposal, there is an inclination to use it. When all you have is a hammer, you are liable to start hammering things regardless of whether or not they ought to be hammered. Learning how to use a tool, particularly a sophisticated tool like statistics, requires hard work and persistence. Having put in hard work and persistence, humans really like to see value coming out of their hard work. They want to use their tools. And this is why, if you teach someone sophisticated management techniques in an MBA, they will go out into a company and use them. And if you teach someone how to patch clothing, they will go looking through their wardrobe for clothes to patch. And if you teach someone debate and public speaking techniques, they'll bring those techniques out at the next Christmas dinner with their extended family. People want to use what they have learned. And on the flip side, people can't always use what they don't know. So learning a tool is, to some level, always creating a bias to use that tool, regardless of whether that is the appropriate tool. That's the first point, but let me go even further. Not only is there a tendency to want to use the tools we know, but there is a deeper effect on how situations are framed. In short, having a set of solution techniques informs our imagination of what the world is about. Solution techniques actually dictate what the problems are, even before we get how to solve them. If you are trained in carpentry, you can walk around the world seeing the flaws in buildings and furniture, seeing problems everywhere that can be solved by carpentry. If you are trained in business management, you can end up seeing every social situation through the lens of effective people management. If you are trained in clinical psychology, you can start seeing neuroses and other psychological flaws in all the people you interact with. Tools end up defining problems, not just solutions. For the most complicated human situations, like those in politics or other large human systems, everything is there. The psychology of the people, the sociology of their interactions, their individual and collective histories, their financial realities, their social hierarchies, the physical spaces they move in, their medical histories, their diet and exercise regime, the composition of the air and soil around them, all of this. How do you solve complex problems? Well, defining the problem is often the hardest part, and people define problems by the tools they use to solve them. And this applies to statistics as well. Stats is the science of getting meaning out of data, and it is very good at doing that if used well. But not every human situation is just a collection of data. If stats is your lens for seeing the world, then every problem becomes a statistical problem, to the detriment of those situations which are better suited to be seen as psychological problems, or historical problems, or narrative problems, or ecological problems, or medical problems, or engineering problems, or financial problems, and so on. Lastly, all this fits into our worldview, our basic understanding of who we are, what it means to be human, what our purpose is on this planet. Statistics is glorious, but it can also be immensely reductive. Much of the world is data, but it is completely false to claim that the world is nothing but unanalyzed data. That is not a whole and full way to understand the world. Let me finish with a short list of other potential ethical questions about statistical practice. There are many, many ways to go with these ethical questions, so here are just a few. Often, if there is a weakness in a study, that weakness can be obvious to a skilled statistician. Such a weakness should be disclosed, even if it means that the results are somewhat less conclusive. This is obviously a difficult thing to do. Researchers would like to state clear and confident results. Good studies can be replicated, since replication is the most reliable way to turn indications of one study into reliable knowledge. If the design of the study is such that it can never be repeated, well, then its value is very limited. Sometimes a researcher runs a study and ends up with a result other than what they hoped for. Particularly when there is a public interest in the knowledge, and also particularly if there's public funding for the research, the public deserves to know the result even if the researcher disapproves of it for some reason. The most on-the-nose example of this is perhaps medical studies funded by pharmaceutical companies. Say a company wants to see if one of their medications is effective in a new situation. They run a study, and perhaps the study shows that their treatment is in fact counter-effective. It made the medical outcomes worse. That's useful information for the public to know, so there is an ethical argument that the research should be reported. But, obviously, there is a financial incentive against, since any negative press about a medication can lower sales for the company. Communication of statistical information is fraught with ethical concerns. We've already talked about this, but to recap briefly, there are huge numbers of ways to display data. Each way emphasizes something and hides something. Which do you choose? Are you misleading the public with your choices? The confidentiality of data is another major ethical issue. Particularly for human data, there is a strong requirement to keep information about individual subjects confidential for very obvious reasons. However, there is also a strong public good to make as much data as possible publicly available. The data sets used in this course are good examples. They are real data sets created by researchers which have been made publicly available and usable, particularly here for educational purposes. So there is a tension here, which must be treated carefully. Finally, you can always ask a simple question about any statistical result. Who benefits? Someone benefit does not, of course, necessarily mean that the study is ethically suspect, but it should inspire some amount of healthy skepticism. If an oil company runs a study that shows that the impact of oil extraction on the ecosystem is less severe than previously thought, I'm going to be cautious about that study, reserving judgment until perhaps it is replicated without any industry funding. At the same time, if an alternative energy company runs a study showing how amazingly productive and non-invasive their wind farms are, I should show them the same amount of skepticism, regardless of my politics, whether my politics tend more towards supporting oil or alternative energy sources. The same amount of skepticism should be brought to both situations because I'm asking about who benefits by the study and who supported it. This is a whole lot, and this is just the surface. Whole courses could be taken, of course, on statistical ethics. But hopefully this is enough to get you thinking, and we'll pick up a lot of this in the classroom activity.